Hello, welcome to Cutting Through. It's Davina Stanley here today with Lisa Carlin. Now, I wanted to bring Lisa to speak to you all because she has an astounding success rate with transformations. Now, she tells me that McKinsey would say that 70% or more of all transformations fail, and Harvard agrees with them. And yet her success rate is rather different than that. Out of 50 transformations that she's run, only 2 haven't gone well. So, Lisa, tell us a little bit about you, and then let's dive into this whole thing about transformations.
Thanks, Davina. I'm really excited to be on your show and talk to you today. I work as a scale-up mentor and as a strategy execution specialist, and that means that I work with leaders to turbocharge their work, to turbocharge their strategy execution and their transformation. So clients come to me for an independent sounding board and expert advice so that they can have absolute confidence that they'll achieve their project outcomes. And I've worked in my own business since 1999. Early background was with Accenture in South Africa and then McKinsey in the US. And then I came to Australia in the mid-90s, and I worked for a culture change organization. And what I've done since then is bring together all the different functional specialization, if you like. So doing IT development at Accenture, doing strategy work mostly at McKinsey, and then doing deep culture change, and bringing that all together and working in a multidisciplinary way to give them assurance that they will achieve their project outcomes, and that includes behavioral outcomes. And that's what I'm very passionate about, is ensuring that all outcomes from a multidisciplinary perspective are considered. So it's not just implementing systems or reducing cost or improving sales or whatever the different types of projects are. It's also about getting significant changes to the work practices of people so that the change is sustainable. And that's what I've always focused on.
Yeah, beautiful. Because I think your point there about the changes being sustainable is the holy grail, isn't it? Because so often people just don't change the way they work, and they end up actually makes work very hard when they're trying to cobble together the old way and the new way. And I think it just makes a lot more work. If your transformation is successful, you must be streamlining and really ensuring that the new changes and the new ways of working are deeply embedded in the day-to-day.
That's exactly right. So that you don't need external pressure to make sure that the change is embedded, that people actually understand why they're doing what they're doing, and they want to do it in the new way because it makes sense to them. They know how to do it. They feel confident about doing it that way. And so that's really important to me. And then measuring that up front and at the end. So I went off to talk to you because I'm so passionate about the topic that I'll keep talking to you about the things that are really important. But do you want me to finish my background question on what I do?
Go on, why not?
Is that helpful?
Okay. I do have a question for you in my mind, but you go first and then we'll come back to that.
Okay. Since 1999, I've had my own consulting business and delivering transformation in the trenches, which means any kind of change. I use that word very loosely, any kind of strategy execution. And then I got a little bit lonely, and in 2013 I teamed up with a whole lot of colleagues and we formed this umbrella organization called Future Builders, and we're all organizational development, strategy development and execution type consultants. So that's what we do. And then more recently I've founded an academy, a membership academy, Turbocharged Transformation, which I'm also really excited about, and I can tell you about it a little bit later. So that's what I do. If that helps answer your question.
It does, and it closes that question out beautifully. And I think this whole point about turbocharging is really interesting, isn't it? Because I know that something you're really keen about and you're really high energy and so on. And when I hear you talk about making sure that the transformation is delivered on the ground so that people know what they're doing, they're comfortable, they're confident, they don't need external pressure to do the thing in the new way. How do you do that while turbocharging? Because I think those two things could be seen as being at conflict with each other.
Yeah, it's the old saying of slow down to speed up and make sure that the foundations you've got in place are done really well through the design and planning phase. And then that sets you in motion to speed up the whole change. Do you want me to answer that? There are three broad areas that I think would be worth exploring in terms of turbocharging in a sustainable way. And that goes to setting the right foundations for the program. And if you like, I can dive into those.
Go for it.
So sometimes I'm brought in to help with transformation efforts or big programs that have gone off the rails or that aren't quite getting that momentum that they're looking for. And other times I'm brought in to run, well, in the past I used to run a lot of these programs as program director, kind of program director roles. And in many of these organizations, everything looks professional. So I describe it as a very professional approach, right? So there's a project methodology in place, there are professional project managers, there's a setup of some kind of steering committee or project board that is very clear. They're very experienced people working on the projects. There's change management resources. I always look for three key things: that there's a good commercial approach, that there's some change management and it's done well and thinking about people, and the third part is the project discipline. So they've got the basics in place. They've often, there's one example I'm thinking of where they brought me in and they had all of this, right? And yet I'd still describe it as a dark room approach. And that's my first, I'm going to go through three, I think, with you that are the most important things, right? One is getting out of the dark room. Second of all, it's all about the culture. And third of all, it's a multidisciplinary approach. And they're woven together, but I'll address each one separately. So what I mean by being in the dark room, Davina, you ex-McKinsey like me, and how often as consultants we're hired and we are working with the executive team, and we'll go into a project war room and we'll work on things and we'll iterate and we'll come up with a beautiful presentation and we'll go out and present it to the executive. And that is our brief and that's what we will do, and the work that McKinsey does is second to none, and I've seen many consultant work out there. The old way, that describes the old way. I call it the dark room approach because it has a problem in that when you come out and you present something that's all buttoned up and all looks beautiful and is a great, slick, thought-through presentation, people feel that there's no room for them to
contribute,
add something. Yes, to contribute. Question. Exactly. Yes, exactly.
That's where the arms get folded and the people on the ground floor just go, what rubbish, not doing that. This will go away. This will go away.
Exactly.
But we just sit tight. We've been here a long time. We know how this place really runs. This will just go away. They'll get sick.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Now, as consultants, we know that you can probably speak to about 8 or 10 people and you'll get more than 80% of what you need to know, and 80-20 rule, and your report will be right. The problem is that being correct and being fabulous in terms of the recommendations. Sorry, what did you say?
Useful. Being useful.
Yeah. It is still useful in a way, and it's useful because the executives who've hired the consulting firm get the answers that they want, and they've contributed to it, so they believe in it. The problem is when you go and then roll out the communications and present it to the organization, they're not bought into it. And it starts triggering all those neurological reactions in people, which gives you this away response when you actually want towards a response. So if I'm thinking of David Rock's SCARF model, all those 5 factors around the status that people feel, all of those things, the relatedness that they feel to the executive and being part of it, their own autonomy and control over their destiny is triggered. So you're triggering all of the different adverse neurological reactions, and people want to have a say, and they want to feel important, and they want to contribute, and they can contribute. People at all levels of the organization can make such an important difference. I think that's why I say just get out of the dark room. I love the design thinking approach of co-design, where you go in and you talk to people and you work with them in the business to develop the strategy or the answer or the approach.
And
so
how
they are
do you see that coming into play with your McKinsey hypothesis-driven approach? So inside that dark room, if you're to use a pure consulting approach, somebody will have gone in and very quickly they will have asked those questions of the key people and come up with a thought that this is probably the way forward. And it is a hypothesis, it's not the answer. And if I remember conversations with quite senior people here in Australia at McKinsey, the answer was 70% of the time that's right. But it's also very difficult for a consultant or anybody to actually change their view. And I've heard all sorts of stories in that regard about, people pushing too hard on that hypothesis when it is wrong. And it's one of the 30% that isn't quite right. So design thinking combined with hypothesis-based work, can you bring them together, or are they completely polar opposite things?
It's a lovely question, because I've been asking that when I first started understanding and learning about design thinking. I started asking that question to McKinsey colleagues, and I don't, and others that use. So I think there's no question that a structured hypothesis, when you go through and structure your hypothesis before you go in and solve a problem, there is no question that is the fastest technique to use to get to the answer. The problem with it is that, as you say, you have that approach, that answer in mind. And so when you're talking to people, you are testing against that rather than having an open mind. And it creates a barrier to the conversations that you have with people. When you go in with a blank page and curiosity, and you ask them without a structured hypothesis, you'll get a much broader answer and you'll get much broader engagement. From every psychological sort of theory, every neurological theory, that's the way to get to brainstorm, right? When you're brainstorming, no answer suggestion is wrong. I believe that the only way that these two approaches are compatible. So one other factor to consider is that we're always going to have a hypothesis, and that's why I say I differentiate between a structured hypothesis and just a hypothesis that you innately have in your mind, because we all will have that, a hunch. Yeah. So the way I think the only way I can see to make these two approaches compatible is to first go in with that hunch and talk to people, and then from those conversations develop a structured hypothesis that you can then test out with those people and refine and work through a solution quickly. And I would do that, and I do that with small groups of people. But the important thing is that everybody has a chance to opt in. And there are ways to do that where you can give everybody a chance to opt in, maybe it's surveys or invitations, and then you choose representatives and you have working groups that do that. So this doesn't have to be bigger than Ben-Hur. It still can be done in a relatively short time frame and worked through. And there's obviously getting out of the dark room and having these co-design conversations. It's not going to be possible in every single scenario, especially where you're a listed business, you've got market-sensitive information, it might be relating to an M&A. That clearly cannot be done publicly because it's very sensitive. But in most cases, there are things that can be worked through. And so I think that's the trick, is to find those items, those things in the whole approach that can be spoken about. And then when people have their say in that way, they will be much more bought into the solution. Yeah.
And so are you saying then that even if you're doing something highly sensitive like an M&A or a cost out, a major cost out, either one of those could be market sensitive, let's say, you could find reasons to suggest that we're optimizing our performance in a particular area, and you could bring people in to talk about that little piece of the puzzle and share their observations and make some contribution so that people feel they know something's afoot, but it's actually pitched as an optimization, which is a BAU type of thing in an organization. We're always trying to get better. So either side of that coin, it could be that they include it. Or are you suggesting that for major cost outs, big M&A, that actually for the most part, they need to be dealt with more privately? But if it is just genuinely an optimize the way we work sort of project, then bring everyone in. Like, where's the line that you see?
It's a really good question. So there are always going to be negotiables and non-negotiables. So if I think of one example with a restructure, the high-level structure was developed by the CEO and the top executive team. The details of the structure could be worked through with everybody else, right? So that's an example where an answer or an approach can be done in two stages. And I have used a very simple template of just two columns: what's negotiable and what's not negotiable. So you very clearly outline to people. I remember we did this with a government organization, and they have a number of different affiliate organizations and the change that they had in mind was going to impact. It needed everybody to get on board to do this. So we invited representation, landed up with about 150 people in the room they probably came from about 30 different organizations. And we were really clear about what was non-negotiable with this, right? And because we'd done a little bit of consultation even already, when you put them up, it made sense, right? There are certain things that had to frame what we were doing, right? And then there was a whole lot of things that were negotiable around how it could be done and the details of it. And so people felt they were very happy. People to have some framework to work within, and everybody accepts this. No matter how senior you are in an organization, even the CEO is working with some non-negotiables. Right? Constraints, exactly. But there are always negotiables, and if people can then engage in those negotiables, we had some fabulous answers and in fact, that work has gone out and it's public now, and it's a strategy that's having massive ricochets in the rest of government and for people. So it's a very exciting one to see that all the different organizations had their place, understood how they could get involved, and when the whole strategy and implementation approach was published, they could see their part in there. We try to use their words as much as possible. And then when we looped back to them and brought them back into the room to later to show them what had been done, they could see the difference that they had made. And when people have a chance to contribute to something, their sense of ownership goes up dramatically. And that's an example of then people, they're adjusting their approach as you go. So that's why I often use the word strategy activation rather than strategy development and strategy implementation.
I like
because
that. Yes.
you actually... I do a lot of work with a colleague, Dr. Norman Chorn, who traditionally he did strategy and I did the strategy execution. But what we've come to realize is that it's actually intertwined. And the minute you start developing a strategy, you're actually starting to implement it. Right?
Yes.
You've already set the tone for implementation. So if you're doing it in a room of people who have volunteered and opted in to developing something, there are those non-negotiables or constraints, and the rest of it they can do. So if, for example, you're working in a cost reduction, so one of them that I did in a large organization, it was a $26 million cost reduction program, and there were parts of it that were easy for people to get on board with, right? So one of them, for example, was a travel system that we were changing. And we, instead of doing all the design up front and deciding that darkroom approach, what we were going to do to reduce the travel costs, there would have been over 10,000 people in the organization. Mm-hmm. Instead of doing it the old way, traditional way, the darkroom approach, because they would normally do that and then set up a tender panel once you've actually got the tender defined, right? So instead of that, we got a working group together who was the tender panel, but we got them involved right up front. And we got them involved, they were a cross-section of the business. So there was ownership, there was an understanding that people were contributing to that. And they could find a way so of course we had an idea of what we were going to do, what the approach might have been. And part of that was non-negotiable, but the whole implementation approach was negotiable. And so that tender panel were involved in so many facets, including the rollout. And I'll come back to that example. I'm probably diving too deep now into dark room, and I could keep talking to you about it for hours.
It's interesting because it puts some colour around it and people can picture what's happening there. This idea that people can contribute, I think, is really important. I'm guessing one of the biggest challenges that I see in working with people is that they often don't know why a change really has to be this particular way. And so I can imagine if somebody's involved in contributing to the new way, they're involved in discussions around it, they're hearing their colleagues' perspectives, they're getting out of their own heads a bit and their own role and their own circumstance by each of those conversations. So already just by having that conversation, they're getting a broader sense of what's really going on and what the issues are, and a better sense of or just understanding other people's perspective. So that is enormously helpful. But also then when they put their idea forward about, okay, I think travel needs to be organised this way. We need to go with this only one provider all the time, and that's because they're amazing and that's just the way we should do it. Then if they hear then other people's perspective, oh no, they don't suit our kind of travel, they just don't suit fly-in, fly-out workers or whatever the thing is, I don't know. And they hear why, they're like, oh, I see. Yes, I don't like that because I like my way, but I understand. I hear you. So it's not the leadership coming down and saying, we're going this way forward in a vacuum. They're actually hearing from peers and other people in the organisation on the way through, but also seeing that other areas that they have not been involved in, they know that process has been put in place for that discussion point that they may not have contributed to. So I'm assuming both of those things help, that, okay, my idea didn't get through, but I get why. And this other thing I haven't been involved in, but I know there's been a really good process, so I can trust it a bit more, even though I don't like it too much. Is that part of what happened?
Exactly. Exactly, you're exactly right. Because they've had the second group, although they're not involved, they've had an opportunity. They know somebody from the areas involved, so they feel like they've contributed, or they can support the process. So that's
Yeah.
really important. Yeah.
Yeah.
You're going to laugh when I tell you this. The organization had a massive behavioral barrier to get over
Right.
because they were paying a per diem and people were profiting from that.
Oh, yes.
They were either sleeping in a flea bag motel
Of course they were. Yeah.
or they were sleeping in their cars.
Oh, no, not that bad.
Yes, yes.
Oh my goodness, I like those. I do recall like these kinds of models though have taken advantage of here's your rental allowance when you're living in a foreign country, and you look at that and think, my, that's generous. We can do it for half that. Keeping that. So, but sleeping in a Fleabag motel, I get. Car? That's extreme, and that possibly impedes performance.
Well, just possibly.
Not great sleep. No showering either.
Yeah, you can imagine the potential backlash.
Oh, I can.
And you can imagine the union sensitivity in this organization.
It's part of the package.
Exactly.
Oh my goodness. So this brings in incentives, which is the biggest barrier to implementing change of any kind. It's what are my incentives for doing it this way?
Yes.
And that's the number one thing to trip over every single time, isn't it?
Yes. So if that is your non-negotiable, and we're moving away from per diems, you can imagine a backlash in an organization like that. So they are. I'm telling you this as an example, giving this as an example because we spoke about some situations where a darkroom approach can't work. There's always a way to involve people in some decisions about how a change is made.
So how did you get over that one? So the leaders said this per diem thing is a rort. It's going to stop. No longer do you get this many hundreds of dollars and the freedom to choose how you travel. That's over. How did you get over that with the individuals who'd been inflating their income and the unions who were really quite keen to help people continue on that path? How did you do that?
There was some negotiation involved, and the biggest lever that I think is the learning is that the tender panel became not just choosing a software system that was going to help us select which system would help, to a booking system that everybody would have to use. It was taking a step back and saying, how are we going to implement this approach in a way that gives people the biggest choices and that people feel has been the fairest approach to get there. Right. So that's what it became about. So the non-negotiables were, it had to be not a per diem system, right?
Yes,
it had to be an actual cost, and everyone could agree on that's the constraint, but how it was to be implemented, there was a lot of latitude, and that's where we were able to engage people in that. And then they felt they had a chance in that decision, yes.
So does that mean, just to try and make it really concrete, does that mean, for example, that I need to go on a work trip and I've got to go for a week? I can choose if I stay in a hotel or an Airbnb with a kitchen. I can choose, I'm given a dollar amount according to maybe my level or the length of stay or some metric, and I can enjoy staying in something that's pretty comfortable, and I can decide what kind of place that's going to be. I'm going to have a lot of freedom with how I spend that dollar budget, but if I don't spend it all, that's on the company benefits, not me personally.
That's exactly right, because those are the kinds when you ask for objections, people are not going to say they sleep in the car. What they're going to tell you is they need a particular place with a kitchen because they've got gluten-free severe allergies and they can't whatever the constraints are. So, yes, exactly. You can give them a choice of self-catering accommodation, right?
Yes. Okay.
And you give them those choices. So
And
that's exactly, you hit the nail on the head. Yes.
and make
they
sure
feel
it's very comfortable, that they can look forward to as a little bit of a luxury, rather than, that the budget isn't so skimpy that they think, oh, that's not very nice. Obviously, it's better than sleeping in a car, but it's still something they can look forward to, rather than, oh, I've got a hard bed in a really cheap place because the firm's cutting costs everywhere.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. All right. So even for things that are have very significant personal impact and cost, you can still engage people in the discussion, give them agency, and get them to buy in with things that they really don't want.
That's
okay,
right.
and get it to happen. All right, beautiful. All right. So dark room, bad idea very often, unless absolutely essential and needs to be very sensitively managed. I understand that. All right, so dark room, very good. Next thing, culture.
Yes.
Talk about that.
So we know that when managers and executives join an organization, we've all seen examples of them not quite fitting in and being quite attuned to the culture. You usually pick that up in the interview process, but sometimes it's hard to do that, and they don't fit in and they leave after 3 to 6 months. We've all seen that. So we know intuitively that we need to, I use the word acclimate to the culture. So it's like if you were going to compete in the Olympics overseas, you're working you're in a different time zone, you're in a different weather zone, you're in a different country, you've got to acclimate for a while. All these Olympic athletes go early, get used to the altitude before they can operate at their optimum. Same with executives. They go into a business, they need to get a sense of what the environment's like before they start implementing wholesale changes. Because if they don't acclimate to the culture, they will be sidelined, ignored, or booted out. So, quick example, one of the executives I know, who's a divisional executive, came in an open plan office, and they weren't comfortable working in open plan because that's not their working style. So they put up these walls around them, and none of the other divisional executives had that. None of the people had that. It created this us and them. People just really didn't like it. It wasn't just the walls. There was a whole lot of other factors. But that person did not last more than about 3 or 4 months. He just didn't last. So we've all seen that happen. What people tend not to think about is the reverse is also true. If you can figure out what to do in the culture that you're working in, what are the levers, what are the things that characterize the culture that you can tap into, you can turbocharge your transformation. You can accelerate your strategy. You can get amazing results on your projects. You can get incredible excitement and energy around things that you wouldn't expect.
Okay, so
and that's what is.
Give us some examples. Make that.
Okay, so there was a highly siloed culture that I worked in, where every single business unit or division really looked to I'm going to call them divisional executive, that was their person who, no matter how many levels they were down, that was their person they took the guidance from, not the CEO. So I'm thinking of 2 different examples here, so I'm just trying to narrow down to one. So we couldn't develop a approach that was going to suit the entire organization. So the CEO wanted to implement a new approach to customer service and interacting with customers that was going to affect every way that they interacted, from systems to people to everything, processes. And although we had a sense of, so this was one that it was a while ago, so I managed the program or project. We had a sense of what those things needed to be to change, but it was never going to work even if we got a cross-functional committee. They would not agree that they would want to, in that kind of siloed culture, everybody wants to be different. So what we did was we ran workshops in each business unit separately and drilled into their needs and what they wanted. And then they came up with their top priorities. And so it was a little bit of, we had that sort of hypothesis at the back of our minds. We tried to put that aside and just talk to people with a very open sheet of paper. And lo and behold, once we collected all the different answers that people had, they were pretty similar. Like there were some very strong themes.
Yeah.
And so when we put forward the changes, there was a lot of buy-in, because people every single person were invited. Not everybody came, but they had the opportunity to come if they really wanted to.
Yes. And surprise, there are common themes about the way people want to work, do work, what their needs are. And
yes.
They just hadn't realised how similar the other tribes were.
Exactly. And it was a hugely successful program. So we had about 10 of us on the core project team. And when we celebrated the success at the end of the project, there were 120 people involved who were all significantly felt like they had contributed to the success of the project, because they had led parts of it, changed their work in their area.
Yeah.
It might have been the training team or the marketing team,
yes.
or the business development sales team. They'd all done something different to contribute to the success, and of course all the technology people. It was a huge success, and in fact this business won numerous public awards for the change, for technology awards, industry awards. It was a fabulous achievement for the team,
isn't it? No, that's it's such a lovely feeling when this kind of thing works, and it reminds us, I think, that our work is actually about people.
Yeah.
All of these organizations provide a service that is for people, and they're run by people. And it's very tempting to forget that and think, oh no, we've got to just focus on our profit numbers and all of those things. Those things matter, of course. It's a measure of how successful the thing is that the organization does if those numbers work. And I think people really enjoy having pride of being part of something that works, whether that's a transformation or just BAU, business as usual sort of work. So, no, I think that's fantastic. Okay, so getting very deeply into the culture and understanding it and playing it back to people is key to this success of just helping people feel part of it and buying in and really rolling forward. And you talked there about cross-silo transformation, and we've all seen organizations which are like that are very siloed. You also talk about having a multidisciplinary approach, which is a different kind of silo to break down. So tell us a little bit about what happens there and why you would not think of using a multidisciplinary approach. What's special about yours when you're thinking about transformation?
Yes, great. Thank you, Davina, because it's a topic that I'm very passionate about. So when you go into what I call, I've got these different sort of 5 different levels of approaches to strategy activation, and one of them is the professional one that I mentioned before. At the top, you've got the unicorn approach, right, where that's the magic zone, you're out of the dark room, everything's happening well. In that professional approach, you would have at least a person with strong business acumen or commercial knowledge involved in the program or project or initiative or transformation or strategy or whatever you want to call it. You would have a project manager, and you would have a change manager or somebody who understands change, right? Culture's often not acknowledged specifically, which is why I'm so passionate about that. And I've got a whole academy, Turbocharge Your Transformation, which just every single module that we have looks at what kind of culture are you in, and looks at everything through a culture lens, right? Whether you're doing project planning, whether you're doing a business case, whether you're doing communications, anything through a culture lens. So that's critical. So all these three items you'd have, and ideally you would be, to really get into that unicorn zone at the top, you'd really want to be having an integrated approach across all of these and really understanding your culture. The more amateur level that I sometimes see is people who changes or transformations where one of those elements is missing. So there's been, it's just, we don't have the resources, we don't have the budget, whatever the reason is, and so one of those elements are not put in place. In the more mature organizations over the years, I've seen more and more acknowledgement that there's the need for these, right? And many of your clients, Davina, like you're working with executives who are presenting board papers, who are a lot of them are very big, mature, established organizations. They would have a very professional approach. Yeah, they would have all of these things in place. Yeah. And so it's surprising some still don't. Okay, but let's say they've got all of those. The next level is then you'd have to question is, do those folks, are they engaged in the right way by let's call them the transformation leader or the program director or the business unit manager or the sponsor or whoever's driving the whole program? So if they're not engaged in the right way, there are problems. So I'll give you an example of one program that was running in an organization where I was asked to come in and mentor the program manager, because what he had done is he had a whole lot of project managers reporting to him. He had the change management, and there was obviously a business executive allocated. There always is with business acumen. The problem is that the program manager himself didn't have enough business acumen to understand the commercial trade-offs that are being made. And the business owner, divisional executive, wasn't involved sufficiently and consulted sufficiently around the critical decisions. They were too busy, basically. And so it was a move of a business to a digital business, a completely digital delivery business model. And they didn't take into account that they made wrong calls, commercial calls. And that was because the project manager didn't have the right skills, the program manager, sorry. So that's a problem. It's how these three, so when we think of those three, I draw a Venn diagram with three circles. You've got business at the top, project and change, those three circles. When the person that's running the whole program can't think from a multidisciplinary perspective of the middle of those three circles, then we've got a problem, right? Because if they can't factor in the way to make commercial decisions, or if they don't have the knowledge, they need to ask. So that's the first problem. And the second big problem is that they were one of these program managers who, I call them, they can't go beyond the Gantt chart, right? They are a process. The governance and process and everything was on paper was perfect, but they didn't engage the change manager in the right way. So the change manager was doing stakeholder briefing packs. They were focused on the communication element, but they weren't involved in the core project decisions with the executive members. And so they were kept to the side.
Execution.
And they were... Sorry?
Execution only.
Yes, exactly. So you've seen it. Yeah,
Mm.
and what happens when you see something like that, Davina? What do you find?
I see it quite a lot. And that notion of the Gantt chart, I see happening with the change management quite a bit. And it's sometimes because those running the Gantt chart need the process. Their experience level or the way their mind works is that they really want process. They need process just because that's them. Sometimes they're not included when they could add significant value, and maybe they don't have the influence skills to get in the room to have the conversation. And I think your point about the leadership there being just too busy, that it's very hard to get priorities right, isn't it? To actually know that these people must be included. And sometimes I think it can be done in ways that are not very onerous. It's just remember to invite them to the meeting. Tell them not to say anything and just listen if necessary, just to give them visibility. Sometimes that's all it takes. But you're all about turbocharging. And again, this whole notion of getting things done very quickly, but getting that right balance. How do you deal with that? How do you notice it with that imbalance, and how do you fix it while turbocharging?
It's very difficult when the people involved don't have the skills. And so a big part of it is getting the right. So when I hire contractors for clients who are to do these different roles, I try and have each, so whoever's doing the business role, the project role, and the change role, the more of a multidisciplinary perspective they take, the better, right? Which is because they will be able to pick things up that are outside of the square and be able to work with everybody in a much more strategic way. So that's part of it. The other part is having the person who is that integrating mechanism. And I use the word, I'm very terminology agnostic because I go into so many different organizations, they use different terminology in different ways. But let's just call it the transformation leader or program director, because most people relate to those terms. That person needs to be able to have enough knowledge of change management, of business acumen, and the project side together. If they don't, another option is to provide a mentor to them and or the team. And that was the one that I started telling you about, where a very large organisation, so this would be one of Australia's largest employers, had a project that went off the track, wasn't getting the momentum that they need. And they had very capable people in all the roles, but there were just some things that they were missing. And one of the biggest things that they had missed is they had a list of about 70 different stakeholders. So they'd done, it's again, very professional, looks all good, had the right people, had a list of, done their stakeholder analysis to determine who needed to be kept in the loop. But this poor team was being run ragged between these 70 different people. They couldn't even get through the list of people every time they had a decision.
There's no priority.
It's a lot.
There's no prioritization
Exactly. Exactly. That's it. And there's no leverage in dealing with 70 people individually. You've got to turn them into groups and around their particular focus areas and mix them up at the right level and the right cross-functional then you've got your architecture, execution architecture set up for success, right? So that is so it's those things. The answer will depend on how you turbocharge each project, but getting that multidisciplinary view in on each piece. And that's why I keep saying it's not stakeholder consultation is not just a program manager or an executive role. And especially around setting it up. It's not just a change management person's analysis. It's not just a part of the project management governance. I'm thinking of my 3 circles again and drawing pictures in the sky for our listeners and I will provide this in so you can share it with folks. the diagram, and it's in a document called my 17 top tips, and there's that Venn diagram that I keep describing. Yeah. So you can think about the execution architecture from an integrated multidisciplinary perspective. Then when you develop your stakeholder structure, your way of managing your stakeholders, you've thought about all of those things. You've ensured that there's injection of business into each of those groups. You've ensured you've got the right levels. You've ensured that it's built into the project architecture, so you've got some traction around it and it's a regular part of the rhythm and routine. And you've built it into the change management approach in that you've thought about those perspectives, and it suits the culture. So I'm not talking about heavy bureaucracy and loads of extra working groups and people are running around for as many meetings, but it then made it so much easier. So the project team were relieved because they weren't bogged down in all the stakeholder management. And it sounds really obvious, and they were all really good people, and when I said that to them, it was like, oh, of course. But because they're in the weeds, there's 70 or 60 people on their stakeholder list. They're so busy. They couldn't see it.
So good, right? So good.
Yeah.
And being so thorough. And this is a big project in a big organization, so this is a burden we must carry because it's just big.
Yes, this is their big strategic project.
Yes.
And so all the stakeholders are important, and they all need to be consulted with individually, because if you're a SVP or whatever, you need to executive, you need to be consulted.
But I think what you're doing here, along with the get out of the dark room and the culture piece, all of these seem to me to have a common thread, which is not quite, but it's a little bit like crowdsourcing the solution.
Yes.
In the sense that what you're doing is trusting people to be involved. You are encouraging people to help each other and planting seeds across an organization in an appropriate way to get people involved and get people mobilized or activated in their own area. And the stakeholder piece is it's a natural place to that. If you have visibility over a certain area, you can easily include some conversation around something that's going on in your standard meetings or what have you. It becomes just a natural part of the conversation. And no, I love this. It's removing the complexity that just doesn't need to be there, and empowering people to do their thing.
Exactly. And another way to think about it, Davina, which will appeal to you, I think. So you've got a massive following, and you're building a community yourself with all the work that you do and the folks that want to learn how to communicate really well. It's a community. And so you know about community. And the folks listening to this call will know that word community will trigger different reactions. So I'm a chair of a non-for-profit in my spare time, and I am building a community of volunteers. Many of my executives, I do a lot of work in the tech industry, and a lot of them are building communities of customers.
Yes.
But there's another kind of community, and people don't use this word in this way, but it's a community. Inside organizations, there's a community for change, right? And Absolutely. It follows the same principles. And the energy that you can get from empowering, I hate the word empowering, but it is. It's empowering. It sounds like a consulting jargon word. It does say it. Empowering. Exciting people to join a movement, a community, a group that's going to make a difference. I have seen careers of the most junior people take off because they're involved, and all of a sudden they're one of these very junior young people who just take off and shine. They can add so much value. They take a little part of their day job and they take it out of their box in the organization, and they can shine, and it's beautiful. Yeah, and it's so exciting to see, and the executives get so excited because their work gets done so much faster, and it's just lovely to see. And there's this interaction at a level that you don't expect.
Yes, Yeah, no, I
Yeah.
love it. And I love seeing your face light up about that. And we were talking yesterday about, or the day before, about what is it that drives us. And it's about growth, our own personal growth, of course, because we're part of this story, but also just helping other people to grow and helping organizations to grow. And I love seeing that in a corporate setting, that if we can, I think, sometimes worry that people might become a little jaded about the difficulties of work or all sorts of things. And people do. And I think all of us have seasons where we're more or less motivated and more or less jaded. But just seeing that spark come in is so exciting for all people concerned. And senior people I work with love seeing that in their young people and love seeing people think out of the box to solve problems in really great ways. It motivates them to see the
Yeah.
excitement in others.
Yeah.
Creates a really positive vibe that's just nice to be around, isn't it?
It is. It's very
Yeah.
exciting.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
beautiful. Look, we have covered such a lot of turf here, and I love this Venn diagram that you talk about and making sure that you have a balance overall in your project management where you've got your program director, your somebody with business acumen and somebody with change management. And with, I imagine the Venn in a perfect world is perfect circles for each with the overlaps, but you can stretch or shrink a little bit in direction so long as a whole that all of those things are covered off with those three people or a mentor in the mix. And then the three things that we talked about, getting out of the dark room and then making sure you align with culture. And then finally, this notion of having a multidisciplinary approach around that so simple Venn diagram. Now, you've got so many ways in which you help people through your corporate work and projects that you work on, and also through your academy and so on. You've got 17 top tips that I've had a look at that look fabulous that we'll offer to people. And you also have a survey, which I did yesterday, which was very thought-provoking and I thought very useful.
Thank
We
you.
look forward to giving those to people. Do you have anything that you'd like to add before we wrap?
I have this huge passion to share all of this with people and for them to learn that there is a different way, that project management doesn't only need to be Gantt charts and process and governance and plans, that change management doesn't only need to be frameworks and analysis and presentation, that all of this, that agile doesn't have to be sitting there as just in the project management box for some organizations, that design thinking isn't just a technique that you can pop in and out when you think it suits, that all of these approaches can be blended together in a way that is practical and easy and that builds momentum. So I really, Davina, I appreciate being on the show. I want to get out there and share it. I've spent the last 25 years buried away in all these organizations doing this stuff and not getting out there. Now I really want to share it. And I've got this academy called Turbocharge Your Transformation. And I would just love people to join because every 2 weeks I've got either a live Zoom where we cover topics like this every session, each month a different topic. And I also do group coaching of people. And if people are too shy to bring their problems to those group coaching sessions, or they're too sensitive and too confidential, they can email me before and we'll describe scenarios in the sessions in a group. So I invite people to join me. I would love to be working with more people and making changes to more people's careers and making changes to more organizations.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I think so many people can benefit from all of that. And that idea of turbocharging, I think, is appealing to absolutely everyone. And so I commend you in what you're doing. Thank you so much for spending some time and talking with me today. I love our conversations, and I think you've brought such really great value to everybody. And so just so that anyone who's listening knows where to go, if you're on YouTube or wherever, you can find the things that Lisa has mentioned if you go to clarityfirstprogram.com/podcasts. and you'll see her episode and the downloads and so on all available there for you. And you can also find Lisa, more about Lisa, at Future Builders. Now, I'm going to get this right, futurebuildersgroup.com.
That's it, futurebuildersgroup.com. And there's also a futurebuildersgroup.com/turbocharge page.
Brilliant. Perfect.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. And we look forward to talking again soon.
Thanks, Davina.